Excellent. So let's go ahead and get started. Good morning to you all. Thank you so much for joining the webinar, which is a multi-organization and corporate effort, leveraging your voice, next steps for ERGs and executive champions on the Equality Act and anti-LGBTQ state bills, brought to you by Out and Equal and our dear friends and colleagues in the movement from Freedom for All Americans and the Human Rights Campaign. I'm Dina Fidas. My pronouns are she and her, and I serve as the Chief Program and Partnerships Officer here at Out and Equal. And by way of very brief background, I do mean it when I say friends and colleagues, because I arrived at Out and Equal after about 12 years at the Human Rights Campaign. And Karina, you're welcome to go to that next slide. And I wanted to give just a bit of perspective, having been steeped in this movement with these extraordinary friends and colleagues for so long. We have had so many watershed moments when it comes to actual legal equality for our community. Let's not forget that while some of us were maybe in college or in the early and mid part of our careers, gay men, for example, could still be arrested, and that court case on our own criminalization statutes was not resolved until 2003. The following year, we as a nation experienced our first wave of anti-marriage bans sweeping across the country, and thus kicked off a rather tumultuous decade with respect to public policy efforts aimed at restricting the civil rights and the well-being of the LGBTQ community. On the other hand, we also certainly advanced the agenda being simple equality, equality for our community. So I wanted to highlight what changed a little over a decade ago. We were in the midst of the Prop 8 fight in California, and roughly a handful of businesses stepped out and said, yes, marriage equality is not just the right thing to do, it's also good for our business. And this was really a catalyst for sweeping changes in which the business community not only course corrected within its four walls and said, look, we don't care that the law doesn't mandate non-discrimination, or we don't care that the law doesn't mandate domestic partner benefits. We understand that it's in our material best business interests to provide equitable policies and benefits for this community, and by extension, to involve ourselves in leveling the playing field when it comes to the civil rights of the LGBTQ community. I wanted to highlight just a quick image on here, a friend and mentor, Ken Charles. Ken Charles has had an illustrious career as a chief diversity officer at a number of companies, but he sat before a congressional committee when we were fighting for federal employment protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And he powerfully testified that part of the reason General Mills was there is that their investment in their workforce doesn't stop with the 9-to-5 worker, it continues with the 5-to-9 worker. And that is the distillation of why every topic we're covering today, from anti-transgender healthcare bills to sports bills, why this is part of vested business interests. Businesses can't pretend that we as employees, we have to go back to our communities. We have to send our kids to school. And our well-being outside of the workplace is in fact our well-being and our ability to thrive within the workplace and within our businesses. We are proudly at a moment in time with over 400 major businesses supporting the Equality Act. I want to also briefly note that this is the first omnibus civil rights bill of any community to enjoy this level of corporate support, and having enjoyed that level of corporate engagement and interest from the get-go, from the introduction of the bill in 2015. We are, of course, rounding the corner on what has been a devastating spring with respect to anti-transgender and anti-LGBTQ bills. I'm going to let my friends from HRC and FFA talk about that, but I want to actually bring us now to the piece of this, which is how do we have a path forward? And so, Karina, if you don't mind switching to the next one. History is made by all of us. And that is not just lofty language. These moments in time, moving the corporate community to support an omnibus civil rights bill that the bill in and of itself was frankly unthinkable to many people even 15 or 20 years ago. What's the view behind the curtain? How did this happen? It happens when we identify the core policy goal, equality, not special rights, not special accommodations. We as LGBTQ individuals and allies within businesses, we identify our own sphere of influence. Maybe you're a strategically placed executive. Maybe your mentor is a strategically placed executive in the public policy department. You gather data, and organizations like ours, like Freedom for All and HRC, we hope to make it easy for you so that you can plug and play the information we give you, gather that data and build not only a business case, but a human case. And I always advise companies and individual ERG leaders and public policy advocates, center your business case in your own organization. Are you looking to expand in a state like Texas? Are you looking to expand in Tennessee? Do you have vested market interests in these places affected? And always outline that, as I mentioned, this invisible line, I think that particularly the pandemic has just blown up. There's no more line between, our public life and our work life. It's completely intermingled, and it always has been for the LGBTQ community. Tell your story, whether you are a vested ally, whether you are a transgender employee, whether you are the mother of a transitioning child. And our hearts really go out to the parents and the young people right now who are directly affected by these mean-spirited, cruel anti-transgender bills. But it's important to tell your story because it removes the sense that this is simply a headline out in the world, and it's actually a direct effect on an organization's top priority, which is its people, its talent. Engage your allies and champions and mobilize, mobilize, mobilize. So we have pulled together a framework here. My colleagues will ensure that the link is in the text box, in the chat box here. I will be now handing it over to an extraordinary public policy advocate, Jennifer Pike Bailey from the Human Rights Campaign, who's going to talk to us about the Equality Act, where it is in Congress, and what steps we can all take to ensure full federal equality for our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dina. I love being able to, even though you left us at HRC, that, you can't get far. We're always here. So thanks again. Like Dina said, my name is Jennifer Pike Bailey. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Senior Public Policy Advocate at HRC. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the Equality Act. And I'm not going to go into deep detail on the bill because I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot about the bill, but I do want to just kind of give a quick overview of it, but also talk about some of the recent developments, obviously with the Supreme Court ruling last summer and President Biden and some executive orders that he's issued. There's been a lot going on. So I do want to kind of make clear kind of the current status and then talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Congress. So as I think you all know, the Equality Act would update our nation's existing civil rights laws to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in all of these areas that you see on the screen. Like you said, this is, really one of the first omnibus civil rights laws that has gotten so much support, and we're so grateful for that. If you can go to the next slide. And then in addition to sexual orientation and gender identity, there are actually two areas of civil rights law that don't include prohibitions on discrimination based on sex. I think that's something a lot of people don't realize, but in federally funded programs and in public accommodations, we are still missing those protections. And so the Equality Act would also add sex discrimination protections in those two areas. Next slide. Another big thing that the Equality Act does is it expands the definition of a public accommodation for everyone. And the Civil Rights Act was written in the 60s, I think everyone knows. And so when they were writing it, they really focused on the areas of law that were very visible to members of Congress at the time. So it literally lists things like soda fountains and lunch counters and places like that. It's pretty out of date. And so when folks were putting together the Equality Act, we wanted to make sure that all of these other areas of life where LGBTQ people, but also people of color, also straight cis women were experiencing this type of discrimination, that we included those areas as well. So the Equality Act updates the public accommodation section to include all of these areas, which are not currently covered under federal civil rights law. They are in a lot of states. And to be clear, that doesn't just impact the LGBTQ protections, it impacts all of them. So when you're talking about a taxi that won't pick up people of color, when you talk about salons that charge differently for men and women, all of these things would be covered. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we've had a lot of developments lately, which are very exciting. The Supreme Court ruled last summer in a case called Bostock v. Clayton County that sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination are in fact types of sex discrimination. So where you have a law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, that also includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And this was a huge ruling for us, and really kind of a watershed moment. And for me, I like to put the pictures of the three plaintiffs on the slide because it reminds me of the urgency of the moment. And that's because two of these plaintiffs died before the case was resolved. And so it's always an important reminder for me that we can't wait for these protections, that we have to keep fighting, and we can't keep putting it off. But it's a little bit of an aside, but I think these protections are so important. And so it was a great ruling to see. In the next slide. And when the new administration came in January, on day one, President Biden issued an executive order that implements the Bostock decision. And so they rightfully said, wherever we have sex discrimination laws throughout the federal code, that will also include sexual orientation and gender identity. So that is in the process of being implemented. That's very exciting. The ruling itself was specifically about employment, and so that was very clear, but the Trump administration had been trying to limit it to only employment and kind of keeping it as narrow as possible. So we're very glad to see the Biden administration rightfully expand it. You can go to the next slide. But we still need the Equality Act, which is why I kind of am talking about these other issues, because I think some folks have been confused about, well, isn't this done already? We do definitely still need the Equality Act for a number of reasons. The first being, like I said, the Trump administration was trying to limit the application of the Bostock ruling as narrowly as possible. So we cannot trust that future administrations are going to do what the Biden administration is doing and rightfully implementing it broadly. So we need to lock that down in law, basically. We also want to kind of further define this discrimination, make it very clear what is covered and what isn't covered, and in a way that you can really only do through statute. We also want a law to help stop some of these bad state laws from passing. And Kate and others are going to get into that, so I won't go into too much detail. The Equality Act won't stop all of them, but it will stop some of them, and that's very important. And finally, like I mentioned, there are a couple of areas of law where there is no sex discrimination protections. So a case saying that sex discrimination includes LGBTQ people doesn't reach those places. So in public accommodations and federally funded programs, we still don't have these protections at all. Next slide. So the Equality Act is overwhelmingly popular, which is great to see. I think a lot of people assume that these protections already exist for the LGBTQ community. That's something we're still fighting against. And so, we're working really hard to educate people of why we still need this law, because it is overwhelmingly popular. Go to the next slide. and as Dina mentioned, it is overwhelming corporate support. You can actually go to the next slide as well. I had put 2 slides together of all of the different companies that support, but I ran out of room and had to go on to a second slide. But I stopped like 100 companies ago because I still don't have enough room for the growing grade support. And we are so grateful for that. And it has been such a huge reason why we have gotten to the place that we are with the Equality Act, is because of the corporate support and the pressure that has put on members of Congress. So next slide. So where we are in Congress. So the House of Representatives passed the Equality Act back in February. They had passed it last Congress as well, but now in this new situation that we're in, where both chambers of Congress are controlled by pro-equality leadership, and we have a pro-equality leader in the White House, we have a unique opportunity to pass the Equality Act. And it is not an opportunity that's going to last forever. And so we are doing everything we can to take advantage of the time we have now. We basically have a 2-year window where we have this dynamic. And so we're doing everything we can to get it done. The next slide. So now the ball is in the Senate's court. And that's where we are focusing our efforts. The Senate Judiciary Committee had a hearing back in March, and Leader Schumer has said that the Equality Act is one of his top priorities. And so we are pushing very hard. We don't know exactly when a vote will happen, but we know that it will happen. So it could be in a few weeks, it could be in a couple of months. But I say that because I really want to emphasize that the time to act is now. We don't have much time, and we're doing everything that we can. If you go to the next slide. And we know that our opposition is also pulling out all of the stops. The debate around the Equality Act on the floor of both chambers of Congress has gotten a bit off the rails. I think they know that we are close, and that scares them. And so the level of vitriol and the level of dishonesty has really gone through the roof. And they are using a lot of the same attacks that we are seeing on the state level, but really, instead of trying to somehow disagree with the policy, they're basically just demonizing trans people, which is really, really difficult to see. But it's, one of the reasons why we need to fight so hard to pass this bill. But I just want to point out that our opposition is working very hard. They are flooding Senate offices with calls and emails telling them not to pass the Equality Act. So we need to make sure that we do the same and more. If you go to the next slide. So the most important thing that people can do to support the Equality Act is to engage with policymakers. I'm going to put into the chat in a second, but we want you to send an email. We want you to make phone calls. We want you to write a letter to your representative, and do all of them because they need to be hearing from you. I think a lot of members of Congress aren't sure whether or not this discrimination is still happening. Obviously, we know that it is, but they need to hear from people why this bill is so important. And so as much as you can, including your personal stories, whether or not you've personally experienced discrimination, talking about the fears that you have for yourself, for your families, it really does make a huge difference. So I implore you all to pick up the phones and start calling them because it's their job to listen to you, and they need to hear from their constituents that they want this bill passed. So that is the end of my portion, but I'd love to take a couple minutes to answer questions. Dina, I defer to you on the best way to do that.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Jennifer. We have gotten a few questions, and I want to direct everyone's attention to the chat box. A few quick notices. By and large, just looking at the attendees, your businesses are already engaged in the Equality Act. And if not, we have posted the link directly to the Business Coalition, so you can benchmark, spot your peers, ensure that you are represented there. That is going to be your best springboard, of course, to making the case internally of perhaps mobilizing the ERGs, And then I think to Jennifer's link on here, also acting in your capacity as an individual. All of you have spheres of influence in your own communities. Maybe you are very close with a faith leader, an educator. Members of Congress need to hear from the full spectrum of Americans that support this bill, which we know, as Jennifer said, is a strong majority. So one or two quick questions, because I know we have to pick up our clip just a touch. There is a question about the relationship of the filibuster to movement on the Equality Act. Is movement on the Equality Act dependent on the filibuster being eliminated?
No, I don't think that it is. We are making a real effort to, we acknowledge the Senate rules as they stand right now, and those are the confines that we're working within. And so we are doing everything we can to get to 60 votes. Which is why it's so important that we get, bipartisan support and get more Republican senators on our side. And that work is happening, but it won't work unless, the lobbying side of things won't work unless people are hearing from their constituents too. And that's why it's so important. But no, we are not waiting for filibuster reform to try to get this done, because we know that our time is very limited and our window is small. And so we want to get this done as soon as possible. I also saw a question about whether folks should still call, even if your senators support the Equality Act. And the answer is definitely yes, because our opponents are still calling those offices. And I think people have a habit of only calling their member of Congress when they're mad about something. And so, they need to hear too from supporters, even when they've done the right thing, to reinforce that.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think I'm going to tee up just two more, hopefully rather brief questions before we move on to Kate. And also just know, everyone, that all the panelists can see your questions, and so they can also respond to you directly. But for the sake of time, a fast one here is, are there any amendments being considered to the Equality Act, specifically to the notion that the Equality Act is tied to access to abortion?
I haven't seen anything specific to that. I know that was definitely a topic of conversation in the House, which is really unrelated to the Equality Act. And so I haven't actually heard much about abortion during the Senate debate. So it's possible that someone is thinking through that, but I'm not aware of anything.
Okay, terrific. Two other things that I may go ahead and quickly answer, which is to direct them over to HRC. So number one, excellent question about other ways that the company can continue to demonstrate their support for the Equality Act. On the HRC website, if you're a member of the coalition, there is great guidance in terms of leveraging your social media platforms and other ways to do that. There's a question, does HRC provide some script language for those individual advocacy calls? I assume the answer is yes, Jennifer. Yes.
Yes, if you go to that link that I put in the chat, all of those resources are available.
Okay, terrific. Now, great question about sort of what we think about as a potential splitting up of the bill. This is always in conversation with omnibus civil rights bills. Jennifer, do you want to comment on that in terms of where energy is focused now versus this contingency plan around splitting up individual components of the bill?
Yeah. So I haven't heard anyone talking about, well, maybe we should just pass the employment section, or maybe we should just pass the housing section. That is really not part of the conversation right now. That being said, if Congress was moving a big housing bill that was separate from the Equality Act, would we say, well, there should be non-discrimination protections included in that? Yeah, we might look at those opportunities, but we're not looking to kind of split up the bill kind of just to take out the harder stuff and pass the easier stuff. That's not part of the conversation.
Okay, terrific. So I think maybe then a summary here before we get to Kate is all efforts, movement-wide and corporate-wide, are focused on passage of the Equality Act. Yes, absolutely, there's always a contingency plan with the movement. A second piece here is, do check out and see if your company is already a member of the coalition, and both Freedom for All and HRC have a bevy of resources about how to further advertise that. This is something that is a little bit more nuanced and sort of takes place at a higher level for some, but I think we know that Certainly corporate voices play an important role behind the scenes in sort of persuading maybe those members of the Senate that are on the fence. And so that level of dialogue for those that are asking is going to be more of a one-on-one with the key policy drivers on this call. So you'll get an opportunity in the follow-up to this to ensure that you're connected directly to individuals to say, hey, I know that our senator is on the fence here, and we have some executives that could be helpful in that persuasion work. All right, so thank you all. We did get a question about the upcoming Fulton decision, which I know we're going to save to the end, and I think maybe Kate will comment on that. But right now, let's turn over to Kate Oakley, who's been at the helm of everything from the Municipal Equality Index to strategizing around the state legislative work, to let us know where we are.
Thank you, Dina, and hello, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in state legislatures, which, as I think you've gotten a little preview, it's been a really, really rough year in state legislatures. And yes, it's been historically bad, with a record number of anti-LGBTQ bills filed, a record number of anti-trans bills specifically filed, and a record number of anti-LGBTQ legislation enacted. As of this week, we're at 23 anti-LGBTQ bills enacted into law this year. You'll see my little asterisk when I say record number. Starting in 2015, when the Obergefell marriage equality decision was in front of the Supreme Court, we started seeing a surge in anti-LGBTQ legislation in state legislatures. And these numbers are all since then, since 2015, and sort of this modern era where we've been in this surge of anti-LGBTQ legislation across the country. Even in this time that has been particularly acute, this year is record-breakingly difficult. Can I have the next slide here, please? We're going to talk a little bit more in just a second about some particular states that are worth noting. One thing that I have a couple slides here up top just to show sort of the trends of where we are this year. The darker little bar there on top shows how many of these bills have been enacted as opposed to how many in the yellow have been introduced. And you can see that the sports ban is really the place where we've seen the most of these bills pass into law, although we also have had a lot of religious refusal laws pass. Folks may remember in 2015, the Indiana RFRA was a huge source of consternation for our community, and certainly it was a place where our business allies stepped up very dramatically to change the tide of that particular conversation. We've actually had several RFRAs pass this year to much less fanfare. But in particular, and if I could have the next slide, please, this year has been really an attack on trans folks and particularly trans youth. So this is a graphic to show how in the time that we have done that we've been in this surge of anti-LGBTQ legislation. So starting with 2015, trans folks have become really a particular target. And in 2015, you can see there were fewer bills. That yellow bar is the total number of anti-trans bills that were introduced each year. So that's obviously the highest. That next bar over is BLS, that's bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports. And in 2016, for example, we were really talking bathrooms. The bills that were being introduced against trans folks largely had to do with bathrooms, overwhelmingly had to do with bathrooms. And 2016, of course, was the year of HB2. After HB2 collapsed upon North Carolina and became infamous for the business backlash and economic reputational harm in particular, we saw our opponents move a different direction. And I see in the chat, there's a question where these are coming from. And yes, the big groups that are pushing these on the opposition are the Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, and the Family Policy Alliance. And they are they're the reason why these bills are basically all 90%, 98% identical with just tiny variations. If you look at 2020 and 2021, The attack on trans folks is back with a vengeance. And these bills are really targeting trans youth in particular. So that darker blue bar, those are bathrooms, locker rooms, sports bills. Those now this year are sports. We did have some bathroom bills come back. In fact, we've had 2 of them enacted. We'll get to those in just a moment. But for the most part, these bills are sports bills. They are focused on keeping trans youth from being able to play sports consistent with their gender identity. The next one, the slightly lighter blue bar, those are bills that would forbid trans youth from being able to access age appropriate, medically necessary, gender affirming care. This is care that can be life saving for trans youth. This isn't about whether or not they can have that paid for through insurance. It's not about, making it harder to get it. It is about preventing trans youth from being able to get the access, from being able to access care that is truly life saving for them. And I just cannot emphasize how important it is that these bills be defeated. We did have one of those also pass into law this year. Can I have my next slide, please? 2 bathroom bills. I mentioned we had 2 bathroom bills pass into law. So these are the first and second, the only bathroom bills to have passed since HB2. And we had 2 of them this year, both in Tennessee. So Tennessee actually enacted 5 anti-LGBTQ laws this year, including an anti-transgender sports ban, which has been very popular, a bill that would prevent teachers from talking about sexual orientation, sexuality, gender in any way, in any class, whether it's sex ed or history or literature, without previously having notified parents and having parents have the ability to opt their children out of having to hear things like gay people exist. There was also a bill that, while not a ban on trans youth being able to access medical care, was an unnecessary and inappropriate regulation. And then there were 2 bathroom bills. One that, bathroom laws, I should say. One that will prevent trans youth from being able to access the bathroom at school consistent with their gender identity. The governor signed that into law at the end of last week. And a business bathroom bill, which will force businesses. And so for anyone on the call who has a location of your company that's in Tennessee, this is going to apply to you. Any business that operates in Tennessee is now required by this law to post the sign that you see here on the slide that basically warns folks there might be a transgender person inside, using the medically inappropriate and unscientific and transphobic phrase biological sex. So that's what's happening in Tennessee. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. And then I want to talk a little bit about this bill in Arkansas as well. In Arkansas, 8 anti-LGBTQ laws have been enacted this year, including a gender affirming care ban, which means that transgender youth who live in Arkansas, whether they were already receiving treatment for gender dysphoria or if they were if they're too young, they are now prohibited from ever being able to access that care. These bills all list out a lot of procedures that simply are not provided to transgender youth in order to try to make people uncomfortable about, and spread misinformation about what medical treatment for trans youth entails. And to make people think these bills are necessary when they simply are not. What they do prohibit that is incredibly harmful are puberty blockers and hormone therapy. They call these experimental treatments, and that they're dangerous and that their risks aren't known, but they're also showing their hand on that because they're allowing people who aren't trans to access those that kind of care if that's something that they need, which is in fact something that is sometimes prescribed for cisgender folks. So it's not too experimental for cis folks, but it is too experimental if you happen to be trans. In Arkansas, where this law has passed, the penalty is loss of a medical license. In Texas, there have been a few of these that have been introduced that are in different flavors, one of which would actually make it child abuse for a parent to allow their child to receive gender affirming care or for a doctor to provide it, which includes up to a felony penalty. In Alabama, a bill just recently, the Alabama legislature just adjourned without having passed this into law, but would have made it a felony penalty in Alabama to have provided this. And so what I want for folks to take away from this slide is, if you have colleagues, if you live in Arkansas, if you have colleagues who live in Arkansas, if they have trans kids in their family, they no longer can safely live in Arkansas. And I think that that's something that people really, the gravity of these bills has not necessarily sunk in. This is in many cases life-saving care. And the idea that this is something that's being prohibited from transgender youth is mean-spirited and cruel, as well as discriminatory. Could I have my next slide, please? Thank you. And so why we need to respond now. In some states, we actually still have the ability to influence the legislative session. Texas is still in session. Jessica, I know, also works very, very deeply in Texas, and we had developments on the anti-trans sports bill happening as early as us hopping onto this call today. That is a bill that is still very much alive. And we also have bills in front of the governor in Florida, and we may soon have one in Louisiana, and those are also anti-trans sports bills. But look, why do we need to respond now? You know, I've heard folks say, well, if we have the Equality Act, then we never have to worry about this again. And the Equality Act is going to be a big, big help, and nobody is more excited about the Equality Act getting close to the finish line than me. But it will not cure everything. And this conversation right now has the potential to impact what happens with the Equality Act. This idea that trans kids are going to take over women's sports, despite the fact that there's the evidence is all to the contrary. Trans girls have been participating in girls' sports in 16 states for many, many years. They participate in the NCAA and at the Olympic level and in professional sports. And there's never been a problem with trans women or trans girls competing alongside cisgender women as cis girls. That idea was first really floated in a serious way at the House hearing for the Equality Act. And then it permeated its way into states. And then these medical care bans have also started working themselves into the conversation about the Equality Act. So our opponents of the Equality Act, the opponents who are putting forward these state bills, they're the same people, they're trying things out, and we have to be able to crush these conversations in the states in order to make sure that there's none of that starts making things in the Equality Act look different than they should. And there is real harm happening now. Trans youth are not able to access healthcare in Arkansas right now. That is terrifying. That could also be the case in Texas. Those bills have not hit procedural, they've missed important procedural deadlines. Doesn't mean they can't be attached to something else that's moving. And we know that that's been something that folks have been trying to do. And the sports bills, I want to just emphasize this before I wrap up and pass on. The sports bills aren't about sports. I mean, I think that there's this feeling that like, oh, who plays school sports isn't an issue to me. What do I care who plays on an 11-year-old's girls volleyball team? How is that my problem? And the reason it's everybody's problem is because it's about erasure and discrimination and marginalization. These folks are trying to make trans people pushed so far to the edge that it eliminates them entirely from life, keeping them from being able to access life-saving medical care, keeping them from being able to play on sports consistent with their gender identity. It's not about sports. It's not about medical care. It was never about bathrooms. It is all about trying to other trans people and push them out and push them away. And that's why even the sports bills, which may not feel super connected to a business case, I promise are very, very much connected. So I'm going to go through as others are presenting and try to answer some of the questions that I think have been popping up. But what I really want for folks to take away from this is that we really need you to speak out and take action. Tennessee has passed 2 bathroom bills, the first 2 bathroom bills since HB2. That is a 5-alarm fire. In Arkansas, trans kids can't access medical care. That is a 5-alarm fire. And Texas is well on its way to being a 5-alarm fire at any given moment. So these are places we really, really, really need for people to be leaning in and paying attention to. So I think that's all my slides. Thank you so much, and definitely available for questions too.
Thank you so much, Kate. And as I look at our time here, just 2 or 3 quick things before we move over to Eric and Jessica Shortall. Number one, to bridge the Equality Act and the state-by-state anti-transgender bills and the focus on trans youth. On a more optimistic note, and frankly, some profound work that our friend John Grosshandler, who I noticed is in the chat, has joined us, the co-head of Gender Cool. If you want to see the absolute clarion call for all of us to act, watch the hearings from the Equality Act, watch their youth ambassador, Stella, tell her story and talk about how vital this is for her. So I invite you, John, to share that in the chat box. One very quick question that I want to elevate to you, Kate, because this certainly strikes at the core of most of our employers' health insurance coverage. Do these anti-healthcare bills cover the mental health of a child? Are they restrictive on the mental health counseling access of a child?
Some of them do, but the Arkansas bill, which is the only one that's been enacted, does not.
Okay.
But some of the others that have been introduced would.
And certainly has a chilling effect nonetheless. So thank you. So with that, somebody who's really at the core of all of our organizations and is a tireless business advocate for equality, Eric Day. He's on the board of Out and Equal and an executive at Dell Technologies. Eric is going to give us this inside view of what it means to evolve your ERG, become a corporate champion. And as he's speaking, as Kate and Jennifer said, they're going to try to go ahead and answer some of these questions one-on-one. Lastly, just rest assured, I know we're going to bump up against the hour, and we will be following up with everybody with all the vital information. So thank you. Eric?
Yeah, I know we're also running out of time, so I'm going to try to be as fast as possible. But for those executive sponsors that are on the call or executives on the call, if you ever want some motivation to do this work, be a strategic advisor for Gender Cool, or allow parents of transgender kids to come talk to you. I put in the chat an amazing story of a young man and a parent's journey with his trans son, who happens to live in Texas. And if that article doesn't change your life, I don't know what will, or get you motivated to do work. So I encourage you all to read that article. And then the other thing I need to talk about is a little bit about what I do at Dell, because it's a big part of what I'm gonna talk about. So I'm gonna do my best to talk about this as humbly as possible because it's important. I run almost a $3 billion business at Dell Technologies. I have almost 1,500 employees. A majority of those employees sit in Texas and Tennessee. So as I talk to you today, the reason, the motivation I have is not only because it's the right thing to do, but it personally affects the people that I work with and I lead every single day. And so what Catherine just talked about is heartbreaking to me. And it motivates me every day. And I'm really talking to executive sponsors out there and ERG members because it's important around ERG leadership as well. I'm going to talk about 4 points really quick. Point number 1, our role as executives, out executives, and I'll get to that in a minute, as well as executive sponsors and ERG members, is to educate. There's 3 main parts of education that you need to do with your company. The first, and this has come up a lot in the chat, you've got to form a relationship with your government affairs team. They are your key to all of this work. If you do not have someone sitting on your ERG board that is a part of government affairs that is passionate about this, you need to educate them and you need to ensure somebody from government affairs is sitting on your board and is passionate about this work. They will help you set up meetings. They will get you with consultants. They will join forces with the HRC and organizations like Texas Competes. It's so critically important. If there is not that link, get it immediately. The second one is communications. This is both a double-edged sword. The good sword is that when they're passionate about it and they want to support you, they'll help you with Twitter feeds, they'll help you with public statements, they'll help you get published, they'll help you do a whole lot of things. The downside is that's the same organization that will tell you to stop. So just recently, for an example, Dell Technologies also is very vocal, not only about these anti-trans bills, but also about the voting bills. we got into not trouble, but we got in a lot of hot water with the Texas government around what was happening around voting bills. And then when the trans bills were heating up, I was actually silenced a little bit, which was hard. But you have great partners and you figure things out. They will work with you on where you can fit in. That might not be as public, but you'll be able to still make an impact by working with people on the ground, which is sometimes just as important as being visible. So don't let the comms team that might be silencing your visibility discourage you from still taking action. But having that relationship is critical, and you cannot do any of this without them. And then finally, your executive leadership team. We talk about reverse mentoring. It's almost became a cliche term within the Out and Equal ecosystem, but it is so important. If you do not know how to reverse mentor, please make sure you're working with Out and Equal about training and things that you can get about reverse mentoring. Your ELT has to understand this stuff, especially when you get to anti-trans bills and you get into gender identity, non-binary stuff. They don't know. It's just a fact. And the more they know and the more that you give them safe spaces to answer questions, including chief diversity officers, it's really important that they get the background, because then they can be your advocates. So that's number one, educate. Number two, be visible. There's a great picture of me sitting on the Texas State floor. Beto O'Rourke even ended up coming because he thought my testimony was so good. No, I'm just kidding. Make sure you go to roundtables. As executives, you'll get invited to these roundtables. It was on the one way Jessica and I worked together to fight the bathroom bill in Texas, as I got invited to a roundtable of like 6 executives with the Speaker of the House, and we were able not to get the bathroom bill in Texas out of committee. So make sure that you get those. Your government affairs team will be able to hook you up with that stuff. You'll hear about lobby days. Get with companies that do this well, like Dell, like IBM. I can name probably 10 of them that do these really well. The HRC can also work with you. Out and Equal can work with you on companies that do this well. These are super important. The more organized they are, the more doors you can knock on, the more Congress people you can, or legislators you can talk to, the better. But these are super important. Testify. I don't care how big a business you run. I don't care how big of an executive you are. If you have the ability to take a day off like I did to do this work, it's worth it. It's 8 hours of your time. Other people can do your work. Don't let your job interrupt your ability to go do this work. It doesn't happen all the time. And right now, the more, and I'll talk about the importance of an executive, but it is really important. I'll just go to it right now. After my testimony, Senator Powell sat and looked at me in the eye and said, "Hey, Eric, if this bill passes, will a Tesla or a Dell Technologies or an Oracle stop coming to Dell?" My answer to her, I looked at her eye and I said, "Absolutely yes." Right? That coming from a senior executive at a large corporation in the state where these laws are is very powerful. Unfortunately, it's still going to the calendar, and I feel like I didn't do my job well enough, but it is important to have very senior people have these conversations because it holds weight. I know that doesn't feel very good. Grassroots efforts are really important, but having senior level people be doing this is also incredibly important. You heard call right. And then the last big thing around being visible is partner. I'm going to pass this over to my very dear friend, Jessica Shortle, in a second, but you need a relationship with HRC. You need a relationship with Out and Equal. You need a relationship with state lobbying organizations like Equality Texas, right? In our Central Texas chapter, which is our largest ERG chapter at Dell Technologies, we pick a central philanthropy organization that we do. You don't think of political lobbying organizations as places that you donate money to, but in Central Texas, the team voted and Equality Texas was the one that got voted in. So that gives money to Equality Texas, it gives money to America Competes, it gives money to Texas Competes, which allows us to have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of this legislation stuff. So allow your ERG's involvement with these partnerships because it really helps with this stuff. Number 3, encourage your ERGs to participate, right? Encourage them to take time off, encourage them to do grassroots. We have just recently come into an issue in a virtual environment. It is against HR corporate policy to allow for group meetings. So we cannot communicate to our ERG to go to the Capitol or to do these things because it's against corporate policy. Many of you guys are probably having the same thing. Don't be discouraged by that, right? If you're vaccinated, if you're doing the right rules, if you're following state guidelines, You can verbally encourage people to do what they think is right. We can't not encourage people to protest, to do their First Amendment right, to go to these events that we're having at capitals across the United States. It's very important that we encourage our ERG members to participate in the grassroots effort. And finally, leaving Jessica a little bit of time, pipeline. I am one senior vice president out of 400 at Dell Technologies. That is not okay, right? I'm probably one of 10 vice presidents above out of 1,000, right? There's 160,000 team members. So if you know executives that are out or are struggling to come out, please let's use resources and come together to figure this out. We've got to not only encourage executives to take positions here, but we also have to encourage our ERG members to strive for excellence in their jobs so that they can replace people like me and you, right? It is so incredibly important that we have people in these senior positions that can act on behalf of these organizations and really make a difference in this fight. And so it's important that we have pipelines, we have succession plans, that we're doing everything we can to develop our ERG members to be the out LGBTQIA executives that they can be, because this is not something that will only go on in 2021. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And with that said, somebody who is my partner in crime in so much of this, I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend and sister, Jessica Shortall. Jessica, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I know we don't have a ton of time left and there's a lot of conversation in the chat about staying on. Just wanted to say I'm happy to stay on. I saved extra time after this. So if anyone can and wants to stay and chat, I will talk about this stuff, excuse me, all day long. So my name is Jessica, she, her pronouns. I am the director of corporate engagement. So the America Competes Business Coalition for Freedom for All Americans, which is a bipartisan campaign for non-discrimination, trying to put ourselves out of business. I just put in the chat, our wonderful friends at HRC, we've partnered on this letter focused on state legislation. It now has well over 100 signers. It's on our website and the HRC website. So I included our link, and someone with authorization to add your company name can get in touch. It is, rapidly running out of runway because the state legislatures are adjourning, but it is one way to engage. Another is I also put the link to our America Competes Business Coalition there. This is different from Equality Texas, excuse me, oh my God, HRC's super important business coalition for the Equality Act, which I absolutely recommend and would imagine most of your companies are a part of. But our America Competes Business Coalition helps business leaders understand what's going on with all of this horrible legislation across states, because it's so much. We try to cut through all of that noise. And then we also are doing bipartisan, mostly Republican focused work on the Equality Act as well. So that's free to join, and we would love to have your companies join, and especially have some government affairs folks be part of that. So please just reach out to me if you'd like more information about that. Okay, so I have a couple of slides. Some of them may be recap, but just wanted to share. So these are the two coalitions I run. Texas Competes for about 6.5 years now. And then America Competes for the past 3 years on a similar model of helping businesses. It's what we're talking about is so much and it's so overwhelming. And you have hundreds of horrible bills filed in states. We help cut through that and go, focus here. Here's what needs to be done this week. Here's the one, member of the Tennessee legislature that needs to hear from businesses privately. Here's an open letter you can sign. So we try to make it really easy. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat about Texas. Again, if you all are willing to stay, I'm happy to stay on beyond and talk Texas specifically. Just going to go through a couple slides very quickly. Excuse me. So I know we've talked about this. Sorry, this has animation. And so it might be kind of annoying. Maybe just run through all of it. But I just want to kind of set into Kate's great slides. I think they were Kate's. Understand the context of what's going on here. So I've been tracking anti-LGBTQ legislation in states for the past 7 years. It's a horrible hobby. And what we can see is that these are very clearly attempts to people who are very scared about the steady advance of progress on LGBTQ rights and on public opinion about believing that LGBTQ people should be treated with dignity and respect and included in all of our communities and rights. So you can see, like the Obergefell decision in 2015, the marriage decision is what sparked this huge wave of religious refusal or religious license to discriminate laws or bills, excuse me. Most of them didn't become law, but this idea that, fine, now people can get married, but I shouldn't have to bake a cake, or I shouldn't have to serve them in a restaurant, or I shouldn't have to whatever. So those have morphed over the years, but they and the orange things, which were very specific bills to say county clerks, for example, shouldn't have to issue same-sex marriage licenses, very much a response to the very scary to these folks ideas that people are accepting marriage equality as something that is normal and good. And then at the same time, we had the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance overturned at the ballot. This is just a non-discrimination ordinance like the ones that exist in more than 20 states and hundreds of cities that include race and religion, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity as protected categories. But these anti-LGBTQ groups were very successfully able to make it about making people afraid of transgender women in bathrooms. And because it worked, we ended up with 2 years of the bathroom wars in 2016 and 2017. When those stopped working, we saw 2 years where these big, very, very well-funded national groups, ADF, Heritage, Family Policy Alliance, and others, put a lot of money, and they tested ads in Kentucky and Michigan, Wisconsin, and other states going, okay, none of this stuff is working. How can we scare people away from supporting LGBTQ people? And what they came up with was, number one, transgender girls in sports, and number two, medical care for transgender kids. And that is how we ended up being presented with these, air quotes, newest emergencies and this astonishing wave, very well coordinated wave. So there's a website called promisetoamericaschildren.org where any lawmaker can go and apply and be given one of these bills already written to go and file. And that's how we ended up in this horrible situation we're in. So the Equality Act passing the US House twice now also was part of that, because that's very scary for these folks. So they are throwing everything they have at this to try to pull back support for LGBTQ people. And I know that that's really scary, but I also say it as kind of a glimmer of hope because we are winning. Feels like we're losing in states right now. But this is proof that we're winning because they're getting more desperate and more cruel in the way that they're designing these policies to now specifically just harm vulnerable children is a sign that they're running out of options to throw at this. So they will keep going. They've got a lot of money, but so will we. And so I see Dina's reminder. I am a cisgender woman and straight woman as well. And so just +1, your comment, Dina, that our voices are super important to say not in our names, because a lot of this is being done in the name of, quote, saving cisgender girls and women. And I say absolutely not. No, thank you. So if we look at the next slide, please. I can't really even remember what's here. It's just to say, I'm rushing because I'm looking at the clock, that I shared some of these links in the chat. Our dear friends at HRC, we have this national letter focused on state legislatures that now has more than 100 signers. We're almost out of time in state legislatures, but this is one way. There's a Gmail address here, which is ours. It's real, that your company, if you have permission to, could sign on to this letter, which talks about these types of attacks on LGBTQ people and on transgender kids specifically as something that businesses oppose. So that we will continue to do options like that year after year. But like I said, this one is kind of, clock is ticking on state legislatures, but you could reach out this week if you wanted to. And then the next slide is...
Jessica, I'm going to interject, and I
Yes.
apologize for just a nanosecond to say there's such incredible energy on this call. Some of you have generously offered to stay on another 5 to 10 minutes, which we're going to do. So I know some are dialing in on the phone and didn't see the chat box. We're going to ensure everybody gets this valuable information. And while we strive to stay in that precise 60 minutes, there really is such necessary energy right now. So Jessica, you have an additional 5-7 minutes.
Okay.
And I know others are going to fill in the chat box. Thank you for your time too. And thank you all for those that have to drop off.
So I just wanted to give a couple of examples of the ways that we curate through America Competes, for example, and Texas Competes, and HRC does this too. We curate opportunity and Out and Equal. We've all partnered very closely on all of this stuff. Curate opportunities for businesses and industry associations to get involved. So sometimes that is individual action. This very big group called American Society of Association Executives, huge, wrote publicly, and we helped them with some of the wording, asking the governor of Tennessee to veto that bathroom signage bill specifically. And we will see now whether they take action. They have a conference coming up, huge conference in Nashville, I think next year. But this is an example of where we can be helpful behind the scenes with wording, pitching to press, et cetera, that some businesses and associations do. Next slide, please. Just showing that there's like kind of an a la carte menu here. This is a video game business headquartered in Texas who testified, someone who's become a good friend of mine, testified in a Texas committee against these SB 29 anti-trans sports ban, and was very explicit saying, you know, when you make families feel not fully welcome and not fully safe here, we may have to think about expanding elsewhere in the future. So making that very explicit connection between safe and welcoming communities you know, business investment and expansion, because unfortunately sometimes that's what folks listen to. So next one, I think I have maybe two more examples here. We do open letters, both at the state level, that Tennessee has done these. We have one in Texas, and the one that I showed you, the national letter. So that's a way we can kind of help businesses feel like there's safety in numbers, so they're not just kind of flapping out in the breeze on their own and can be retaliated against by lawmakers. Joining these coalitions, which is free to businesses, can make sure that you see these opportunities as they're coming up. And then I think I can't remember, I'm sorry, maybe one more slide. Oh, this is my last slide. Thank you. And then we also give business folks lots of private opportunities, because sometimes that is more impactful based on the intel we get from state partners. Or sometimes that's what a business can do, because frankly, it's about to sign a big contract with the governor or something. And that matters too, to the, you know, ability for the business to keep operating and employing people in the state. So we also give lots of opportunities to go. A call to the speaker of X state house would be incredibly impactful. And here's how you can frame it. Here's how not to get dragged into the weeds where you don't feel comfortable, et cetera. So we try to equip business folks. So from an ERG perspective, I would say, I said this in the chat, I'm feeling a little salty today, that I think Pride Month is a wonderful time, actually, as we're all taking a breath and looking at the damage from these state legislative sessions, to say kind of respectfully but firmly within your company that Pride Month is wonderful, celebration is wonderful, Pride merch is wonderful, but the LGBTQ community is under attack year round. And there are great and safe and low risk opportunities for companies to get involved in these efforts in the states and at the federal level, and that we need companies there too, because June is not the only month that LGBTQ employees and their family members matter and need to feel safe in their communities. So, you know, putting that voice forward in a respectful way and saying, look, there are these coalitions that many businesses have joined before us. So it's safe, the water's warm, it's free to join. We couldn't have made it easier to do, can be a really impactful way to help gently move these folks into this more advocacy space. And I will just say, we never shame or bully, you know, our business members to do anything. Some of them don't act on our calls to action at all, and we're not going out publicly shaming them. So we do try to keep it very low risk for them and just create opportunities that they'll want to participate in. And so would love your help in just getting that message across within your company if you're able to. I'm going to stop talking. I know someone had some Texas questions, so I'm happy to stay on and talk about Texas if you'd like.
Yeah, could I ask, since Jessica, you have the additional 5, Kate Oakley, and thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you to the Human Rights Campaign, to Eric, and to Freedom for All Americans. One additional point of clarity here, the real drivers of the direct lobbying and policy work, it's HRC and Freedom for All. We at Out and Equal are very happy to convene the business community and to support your efforts. So again, we're going to ensure you have all of the right information. Can I call on you, Kate, for the minute to minute and a half summary of another very important legal milestone, the Fulton decision?
Yeah.
If there is a minute and a half version to do that. And then Jessica, very happy to have you answer more of this, more of the Texas questions.
Yeah, I will try to do a very brief summary of the Fulton situation. And the very, very brief summary is that we really don't know what is going to happen. So the Fulton case is a case that's arising from a situation in Philadelphia, where Philadelphia has a comprehensive non-discrimination ordinance that includes sexual orientation and gender identity, including in its city contracts. And the city had contracts with child to do child welfare work with child welfare agencies. So these folks were government contractors, and they also happened to be agencies that had a religiously oriented mission. They are contending and are now in front of the Supreme Court contending that they have a First Amendment right to refuse to work with same-sex couples and other couples with whom they have a religious disagreement, despite the fact that they also have a contract that says that they will not discriminate. And they say their First Amendment religious freedom right overrides the obligation that they signed as part of their contract. The implications of this case are really large. I mean, look, I mean, these are not, it's not just that these are agencies that are out there existing in the world doing their private religiously oriented work. What these folks are contending is that they should be able to take taxpayer funds, provide a taxpayer service, and attest that they will abide by discrimination laws, non-discrimination laws, and yet also still discriminate. And so that case is in front of the Supreme Court. We could be getting a decision on it literally any day. And we don't know what that decision will be. And it really could go a very wide range of potential outcomes. So that is the very short answer, is that it could be that the Supreme Court says, no, there is no First Amendment right to discriminate with taxpayer funds. If it's important to you to discriminate, then you need to do that on your own time with your own money and not with taxpayer funds, or they could find otherwise. And so we don't know where they're going to go on that. And it could absolutely have implications for our work going forward, but there's just so much that we don't know about how that's going to come out that it's hard to say too much about where we're going to go from here. That's my very short version.
Okay, thanks so much. And for those that do have the time to stay on, since Texas is such a hotbed, I invite you to also dialogue with Jessica Shortall. And Kate, I hope you can stay on as well, given that you work together in Texas.
So we're looking at the, oh, James,
Sorry.
I'm just looking at your note. We've heard so many stories like this in so many states and trying so hard to get the message across. In Texas, for example, where they're kind of telling each other that the sports bill is not that bad, that trying to break through and help lawmakers understand the trauma they're causing by even normalizing the idea that they can debate whether people should be. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you. Did you cover this one? Any advice on how to voice with Texas legislatures? Many just have voicemail, and our two senators, I usually can't leave a message at all. Did you cover that?
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, no,
Okay.
this is a very practical one. So this
Yeah,
may again require some one-on-one follow-up, but for those that are reaching out but hitting a bit of a brick wall, any suggestions?
So I'm going to share a Google Doc. Tell me if you can't get in, or if you, it's not mine, but if you need to ask for access. But there is a Texas tweet storm being encouraged over the next few days. We know that many lawmakers and their staff and reporters watch the TextLeg hashtag on Twitter. So I know it feels a little bit like keyboard activism, but it actually can be meaningful, especially because the baddies have a lot of misinformation on that feed. And so we're trying to drown it out. So that's number one. Yeah, Kate's saying you can always at them if you can find and just Google and find their Twitter handle. I'd focus on your House reps at this point because the bad Senate bills have passed the Senate and come over to the Texas House. So if you literally just put who represents me Texas into Google, you can search, and maybe this is too elementary, I apologize, I'll put the link in, put in your home address, and your second result that comes up will be your Texas State House rep, because you don't want your member of Congress on this because it's state legislature. And it's that House rep that's got to hear this. That doesn't matter. I mean, if I were being direct, I'd say SB 29 cannot be fixed. It will harm and is harming children now. If this person is a Democrat, do not take for granted that they're going to vote against it, because that is not to be taken for granted, especially in Texas. But so either party, tell them this is harming kids, and if you vote for it, I'm watching you.
Even if they're queer, I was chiming in.
Mm.
They're- Yeah,
Mhm.
please make sure everybody, no matter who
Yes.
represents you, no matter how great you think they are, make sure that they know that you believe forbidding trans kids from being able to play sports is discrimination.
The other thing I'll say is that this bill, SB 29, this sports bill, is in the Texas House Calendars Committee. So it has passed its committee, Public Education Committee, and now it's in this very powerful committee who decides whether or when it will put this bill on the Texas House floor. They only have until Sunday midnight to add this bill to a House calendar. And so I've just put the link to that committee. And you could literally call anybody there. The chair, Dustin Burrows. We know this committee has not set the anti-trans healthcare bans in a way that they could pass, so we know they're listening. But so between the chair, Dustin Burrows, and Democrat Joe Moody, both really, really need to hear this. But literally anyone else, and if you're a constituent for any of these folks, then double extra plus, reach out to them, please.
Okay, I think with that, as we're just shy of quarter past, thank you all again. Thank you, Jessica, Kate, and to the 50 people who hung on. We are going to stay in touch. You will be hearing from us later today, and we will ensure that you also have direct lines to these incredible leaders and experts as you're navigating some of your next steps. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. The Zoom wave. Terrific. Thanks, everybody. We've got a few more folks logging off. And Jessica and Kate, I'll just let you know, I sent an email just to ensure that we know what we're going to send out in the follow-up, and then we're going to save this chat. Thank you both. I know this is an incredibly busy week, and I hope you're all able to keep the faith, as it's been a tough round here.
Gross here.
Mostly I've been sending Jessica pictures of baby legs.
Those are
I
important.
really need more baby photos.
Yes, baby photos for all. We still got a few more outside guests logging off, which is okay. Everybody should know that we
can all, I think we can all
support one
agree that all
another,
babies
whether
are good.
Yeah,
whether
we
it's
can
corgis, baby humans, pictures. Okay. All right, excellent. So Karina, I think if you can stop the recording.